Hi, I'm Caitlin Phillips, and this is The Side Comment. For this episode, Tom Keymer, author of Jane Austen, Writing, Society, Politics, shows the razor-sharp wit and brilliance of Jane Austen through 5 lesser-known facts about the novelist.
Hello, my name's Tom Keymer, and I work at the University of Toronto after moving here from Oxford about 15 years ago. One of the courses I most enjoy teaching is a course we run on Jane Austen and her contemporaries. And I recently had the pleasure of putting together my thoughts from that course in an OUP book called Jane Austen, Writing, Society, Politics. It's an introductory book, so I try to cover as many angles as I can. But in this podcast, I'm going to pick out 5 points that relate to one particular thing: Austen's surprisingly troubled relationship with the literary marketplace of her day, and the difficulties she encountered in trying to make a career as an author. So the first fact, Austen, of course, has been a global bestseller for a century or more, but she couldn't get into print for most of her life. She's born in 1775, she died in 1817, aged 41. We know that she wrote prolifically in her teens and that she finished 3 full-length novels before 1800, before she was 25 then. But the first of these novels, Sense and Sensibility, wasn't published until 1811, when she was nearly 36. That wasn't for want of trying. In 1797, she offered First Impressions, that's the novel that would turn into Pride and Prejudice, to an upscale publisher named Thomas Cadell, who rejected it by return of post, same day or the next day. In 1803, she sold Susan, that's the novel that would become Northanger Abbey, to a less high-profile publisher named Benjamin Crosby. Crosby advertised it a few times, but then he never proceeded any further, and it wasn't until 1816 that Austen got her manuscript back. It didn't make it into print until after her death. The second fact, hardly surprising in this context, is that Austen made very little money from her writing, probably less than £700 during her 6-year publishing career, and nearly half that was for Mansfield Park. £700, that's maybe £50,000 in modern money, and she invested it carefully. But again, that's spread over 6 years. For comparison, one contemporary, the Gothic novelist Anne Radcliffe, sold a single novel, The Mysteries of Udolpho, for £500 in 1794. Another, the Irish writer Maria Edgeworth, got £2,100 for her novel Patronage in 1814. Virginia Woolf famously said that if a woman is going to write fiction, she has to have, I quote, her money and a room of her own. Austen didn't have either. There are wonderful anecdotes in family memoirs of her writing in what her nephew called the general sitting room, subject to all kinds of casual interruptions. She wrote on small pieces of paper that she could quickly hide when strangers called. Her niece describes her sitting by the fire with her needlework. This anecdote, I think, is so eloquent, saying nothing for a good while, and then would suddenly burst out laughing, jump up and run across the room to a table where pens and paper were lying, write something down, and then come back to the fire and go on quietly working as before. My third point is perhaps quite trivial, but it tells us something really interesting about how Austen's novels came to be how they are. Her handwriting was really quite bad. There are letters where she apologizes for what she calls her scrawl, her hasty scrawl. Apart from a couple of fragments, we don't have manuscripts of the 6 novels. The novel wasn't a prestigious genre, Austen wasn't a prestigious writer, and at the time when typesetters had done their work, fiction manuscripts would typically just be thrown away. Think how much the manuscripts of Emma would be worth today, but at the time it's quite likely that it was used to light fires. We do have neatly copied manuscripts of her teenage writings, but the really interesting manuscript is the unfinished novel Sanditon, which she started in the year of her death. It's a working draft full of obliterations and substitutions and overwritings. It's a complete mess. It's in King's College, Cambridge. She's writing fast. She's revising heavily as she goes along. She's rethinking and fine-tuning all the while. When we read Jane Austen, we feel we hear this very immediate voice, this signature effect of spontaneous lightness. In fact, there's nothing spontaneous about it at all. It's a matter of very careful and intensive crafting. And my fourth point, a bit more about that crafting. Jane Austen was what we might now call a minimalist, a believer in less is more. Novels in her time were often what Henry James would later call loose, baggy monsters, lengthy, sprawling, digressive, self-indulgent. Austen hated irrelevant padding, And there's a letter about Pride and Prejudice where she jokingly apologizes for not working in some pointless digressions. She could have added, she said, a critique on Walter Scott or the history of Bonaparte, history of Napoleon. When she revised Pride and Prejudice for publication, she probably made it about 20% shorter than it originally was. And she talks about having lopped and cropped it, that's her phrase, lopped and cropped it, to speed up the pace, as though she's a tree surgeon pruning excess growth. She disliked gratuitous description, and she liked to do things instead by quick suggestion. One of her nieces wanted to become a novelist and ran her somewhat laboured manuscript past Aunt Jane. Leave things to the reader to imagine or visualise, Austen advised her. She said, you give too many particulars of right hand and left. So I'm going to admit that my fifth fact is a bit speculative, but we have to do some guesswork if we're going to figure out how this frankly unsuccessful writer finally got her work published. Jane Austen's famous now for her happy endings. I don't think she liked happy endings. If you look at them closely, they all seem a bit impatient, as though the real race is over and Austen's now just doing a quick victory lap to please the crowd. Sometimes she makes it very obvious. Persuasion. Who can be in doubt of what follows? Austen asks, as though she really can't be bothered to go into the details about this happy ending. Or Northanger Abbey. My readers will see from the telltale compression of the pages before them that we're all hastening together to perfect felicity. That's what publishers and readers demanded, perfect felicity at the end, a marketable feel-good ending. But we know from Austen's unpublished teenage writings that she actually enjoyed writing very different kinds of ending, sometimes in a vein of crazily violent black comedy. One story is about two rival girls on the marriage market, Lucy and Suki. It ends with an abrupt surprise when Lucy, quote, fell a sacrifice to the envy and malice of Suki, who, jealous of her superior charms, took her by poison from an admiring world at the age of 17. That's such a great line, full of vacuous cliches, superior charms, admiring world, with a murder just quietly happening in the middle. There's another early story where Miss Arundel gets courted by Sir William Montagu, but, Austen writes, Miss Arundel was cruel. She preferred a Mr. Stanhope. Sir William shot Mr. Stanhope. The lady had then no reason to refuse him. She accepted him. So the novels Austen wrote for the marketplace of her day are comic masterpieces, of course, but if she'd been free to write absolutely whatever she wanted, they might have been even funnier.